Spider-Man had a pretty good run on the Nintendo DS. Sure, he had some lows, but he also had some highs. So, how does Spidey's adventures hold up on the 3DS? Whilst there were nearly 10 Spider-Man solo games on the Nintendo DS, the 3DS on the other hand has only 3. So let's go through these games in chronological order, see what made them good, what made them bad, as we dive into what happened with the Spider-Man 3DS games. So first up we have Spider-Man Edge of Time, released in October 2011 across North America, Europe and Australia. This game launched on Nintendo DS, 3DS, PS3, Xbox 360 and Nintendo Wii. All versions of this game except the DS port were developed by Beenox. Now, the DS port took some creative liberties with the story, but thankfully the 3DS version follows the same story as the other 3 console counterparts. The story sees Spider-Man 2099 and the present-day Spider-Man tied together across time, fighting different threats, trying to prevent the original Peter Parker's death, as well as Alchemax taking over in the 2099 timeline. Before I go any further into this, I was quite surprised to find out that Walker Sloan, which is one of the villains in the game, is voiced by Val Kilmer. Huh? Anyway, once you launch up the game, you get a pretty cool cutscene, and then the title screen is just Miguel walking into the camera holding Peter Parker, but the background isn't moving, so he's just walking on the spot holding this corpse. So upon starting the game, you are immediately thrown into a fight between Peter and the Anti-Venom. And this is supposedly where his death takes place, and you pretty much do just get beaten within an inch of your life. It reaches a point where Spidey just starts doing this weird drunk walk, which I just thought was hilarious. Obviously he's injured and fatigued, but it just looks like he's drunk. Anyway, as you've probably gathered from the footage on screen, unlike all the DS games which were platformers and 2D, this is a 3D action-adventure game, which is just much better suited to Spider-Man than a 2D platformer Metroidvania kind of thing. Now, as far as I can tell, this is essentially the same version of the game that's on the Wii. It just looks a lot more dumbed down compared to the other console versions, but pretty much just plays the same, it just looks a lot worse. However, this is a full-fledged console game on the 3DS, and I think that in itself is very impressive. The combat is pretty much just standard button-mashy repetitive nonsense, and that charm does start to wear off very quickly, but there are upgrades and special abilities and all the standard things you'd expect in a Spider-Man game to be present. Edge of Time across the board introduced a system called the Cause and Effect, which means that one thing that Peter Parker would do in present day would affect Miguel in 2099, and vice versa. If you think about it too much, it doesn't really make any sense, but when you're playing the game, I have to admit it is a pretty cool feature. Now, unlike in Shattered Dimensions where you had several different Spider-Men with several different gameplay styles, Miguel and Peter both pretty much play the exact same way, just have different abilities. There is of course web swinging as well, but due to a lot of the spaces in the game being quite confined areas, you'll mostly be web zipping around and crawling on walls. The soundtrack to Edge of Time is something else I do have to praise about this game. The music was written by Gerard Marino, who was the lead composer for the God of War games, so it kind of makes sense that it's pretty good. Now, other than the repetitive gameplay and sometimes wonky web swinging and movement, one thing I do have to say is sometimes this story just doesn't really feel like Spider-Man. This was written by actual comic book writers, but there's moments in the story where Peter's just a complete idiot for no reason whatsoever. Overall though, the story itself is very interesting. It's completely absurd and nonsensical, but it's a lot of fun. Now, out of all 4 main versions of the Beenox developed game, the 3DS version is actually the lowest critical scoring out of the 4. The highest was on the Wii, interestingly, which is a 62 out of 100, but the 3DS sadly only has a 50 out of 100 score on Meta. However, having done some reading, it appears that a lot of the issues with this game are actual glitches, game freezes and audio bugs, which I'm going to put down to the fact that this is a full console game squished onto a little 3DS cartridge. Maybe I'm just being a bit too nice. If I were to rate this game out of 100, I would probably put this around the 60 to 65 mark. I had a pretty good time playing it. I'm not in a rush to go back to it now I have played it, but it works. So before we look at our next game, if you're a big fan of Spider-Man content, 3DS, DS, throwback games, then this channel is perfect for you, so why not hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications for my future uploads. And without further ado, let's get on to The Amazing Spider-Man. So, The Amazing Spider-Man was developed by Beenox and released on 3DS, DS, PS3, Wii and Xbox 360 in 2012, and then launched a bit later on that same year on Windows and mobile, and then eventually made its way to the Wii U, the Windows Phone, and PlayStation Vita in 2013. To be honest, it was probably just easier to list the consoles it wasn't on at the time, because that's definitely a shorter list. So pretty much all versions of this game were a open world 3D Spider-Man game, exactly what you'd expect, but of course on the Wii and the 3DS, this was not the case. Of course, at least it wasn't just a 2D platformer like the DS version was, but they left out the open world feature for these consoles, presumably because it couldn't handle it. The Amazing Spider-Man game is one of those movie tie-in games that actually takes place after the events of the movie, which, in my opinion, is pretty cool. From what I can assume, this game is not canon to the Amazing Spider-Man film series, because there's stuff that happens here, like the Rhino appearing, when we have a version of the Rhino in the second film, stuff like that. Anyway, the story pretty much goes as follows. Peter and Gwen sneak into Oscorp after hours, because they've heard the company is continuing the lizard's cross-species experiments. Lo and behold, they kind of are. Then all the cross-species go mental because they sense Spider-Man's presence. They all break out, infect a bunch of scientists, including Gwen, and then Spidey has to go and round them all up, break the lizard out of prison to help him catch them, and that's pretty much the game. Along the way, as I mentioned, he does fight characters such as the Rhino, he also fights the Scorpion, Vermin, and at one point encounters Black Cat. To be honest, this game's story genuinely seems a bit more interesting than the one we got in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, so that's a shame. Anyway, aside from the weird first-person introduction to the game, gameplay in The Amazing Spider-Man is pretty similar to The Edge of Time. It's the same developers. They've kind of gone for a more Arkham-style combat system here, which is absolutely fine by me. Combat is still a bit button mashy, however. Web swinging is a little bit janky. Pretty much everything is exactly as it was in The Edge of Time, just a tiny little bit more refined than it was the first time round. Graphically, the game looks okay. I mean, it's a 2012 3DS port of a movie tie-in game, so I wasn't really expecting anything groundbreaking. There's a couple of moments that really made me laugh, like when Gwen first appears at the start of the game in this first-person cutscene. It's just really jarring.
Hey there.
Hey.
Thanks for coming with me, Pete. You're brave.
The other thing that really caught me off guard with this game was the really weird angle of a picture of Spider-Man on the start menu for the game. Anyway, Spider-Man controls pretty well. There's nothing particularly nonsensical about his controls for the 3DS. There's only a little bit of touchscreen involvement, which is for dodging, which is absolutely fine by me. And overall, to be honest, is a fairly okay port of The Amazing Spider-Man, especially given the console that it's on. One thing I do have to praise this game for, though, is getting the design of the Rhino right, because we all know The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was just a giant mechanical Rhino suit, and let's not even talk about Kraven the Hunter's design. Something that was pretty cool about The Amazing Spider-Man for the 3DS was this Vigilante mode that was exclusive to the console. This used the 3DS's Street Pass ability, so that if someone else you walked past also had a copy of The Amazing Spider-Man on them in their 3DS, then it would exchange data and you could help each other fight crime in this weird little mode. Interestingly enough, there actually was the black suit locked behind that mode, so if you didn't finish the Street Pass mode, you wouldn't be able to unlock all the suits in the game. Anyway, across the board, The Amazing Spider-Man reviewed fine, really. Every single version of the game that has a Metascore is in the mixed or average zone. Sadly, the 3DS is on the lower half of that with a 55 out of 100, with the highest version being on PS3, which is a 71. Now, to be honest, I'd say again, this game could probably sit about a 60, really. It's not a 55 worthy score. I've played far worse games with higher scores than that. Anyway, if you have made it this far in the video, please comment the famous Uncle Ben quote down below. With great power comes great responsibility. So now we move on to our final game. So last, and to be honest with you, definitely least, we have The Amazing Spider-Man 2. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 launched on the Nintendo 3DS, Windows, PS3, PS4, Wii U, Xbox 360 and the Xbox One across April and May 2014. Beenox handled development of every version of this game except the 3DS port, and honestly I really wish they had. But instead this one was developed by High Voltage Software. A developer you may recognise for a bunch of different tie-in games from the early 2000s. They made a Stitch game for PlayStation 2, a Disney Haunted Mansion game around the same time. They also sadly developed a couple of Leisure Suit Larry games, which are just gross. Honestly, not the best reputation for a developer, but here we are. So, whilst the previous two Beenox developed Spider-Man 3DS titles were a big step forward from the Spider-Man DS releases, this one decided to take a big ol' step backwards and turn itself back into a 2D platformer beat-em-up. Great. So I went into this with a pretty open mind because I was well aware that the console versions of this game did not review well at the time. I've never played them, but I avoided them because they didn't do very well. And I thought, hey, maybe they focus more on the gameplay, because now they don't need to worry about trying to get such a big game to work on a small console. They can just focus on having fun and creating a good time. No, they didn't even do that well. The gameplay is boring, uninspired, and just a big step back even from the DS-era Spider-Man games. I'd quite happily take any of those over this one. The issue that I now have is this game isn't so bad that it's good, it's just so boring that it's just bad. The combat is incredibly button mashy, the movement is slow as anything. For some reason Spider-Man crawls faster than he does walk. The web swinging is almost completely pointless in the 2D sections, so I don't really have anything good to say about it. To make matters worse, to get to your next level you will have to swing in a kind of on the rails section to your next level, and this sometimes gets interrupted by a random crime. And it's not like you actually just drop down and fight it, you have to then load into this random place. The first one I did threw me into a building and just told me to defuse 13 bombs in 2 minutes and just acted like it was just a normal thing. Just some really bizarre design choices all round. The sections when you are between levels and web swinging, you have to get to the end of the part of the city you're in within a certain time limit, or else you just have to redo it for some reason. Even though at no point beforehand when you finish the previous level does Spidey say, oh, I've got to get there quick, there's a time limit of 60 seconds. There just now is one. Now, to be honest, I remember The Amazing Spider-Man 2 a little bit as a film. The plot was just overstuffed with too many characters. You had the whole Goblin thing going on, the Electro thing, and then you also had Rhino, and in the background they were trying to set up the Sinister Six. The whole thing was just a bit of a mess. However, this game takes it one step further. I'm not going to delve too deeply into the plot here because it's really long and convoluted, but the game starts with you looking for Uncle Ben's killer, which I don't remember happening in the film, but whatever. And then let me just list the villains that you will face in this film. So you've got the Shocker, you've got Electro of course, the Kingpin is here, Kraven the Hunter is here, Carnage is here, Black Cat is also here. There's just so much going on here. Green Goblin eventually reveals himself as well, and at the very end you've also got Chameleon. There's just so much happening, and honestly, this just sounds crazy. One thing I did enjoy very much so was at the very start of the game, there's a cutscene that features the one and only Stan Lee, and I think he is also at the end of the game as well, which is pretty cool.
Peter? Hey, Stan.
Oh, welcome back, true believer.
Anyway, in terms of critical response, this game doesn't actually have a Metascore for the 3DS, but the user score is generally unfavourable with a 4.3 out of 10. Just for comparison, the PS4 and Xbox One versions of this game scored 49 and 46 respectively, and then the previous gen consoles scored around 55 to 58. Apparently Beenox were actually originally meant to develop this game, but for unknown reasons they dropped out and it was handed to High Voltage Software instead. So I would like to think that perhaps if Beenox handled the development of this 3DS version, it probably would have turned out a little bit better than what we got. So that takes us to the end of our look at the 3 Spider-Man 3DS games. Now this is certainly a mixed bag, with some pretty high technical achievements in the first 2 games, with some pretty low, boring, dull messes at the end. If I had to recommend one of these games, I'd probably recommend The Amazing Spider-Man. To be honest with you, the gameplay is just a little bit more refined than The Edge of Time, and also the story is quite interesting, especially if you are a fan of the Andrew Garfield films. But then again, you could also just play the console version anyway, so I don't know why you'd choose this version over the main ones. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe and tap that bell for notifications. And as always, I will see you in next week's video. Bye bye.
Pizza time.